Hi everyone, my name is Sahana, and today I'll be presenting my research project on the reevaluation of the political spectrum. So, to quickly go over the table of contents for this, I'll basically be discussing my motivations and question for choosing the topic. I'll be going over the background for the research and the papers that I used. I'll be going over the databases that I used and the coding methodology that I used in terms of both R and Python. And I'll be going over the results, generated graphs, what those results mean in terms of the general research question, as well as future research that could be conducted under this specific topic area. So, starting off with the motivations in question, why did I pick this project? So, that has a lot to do with the activities that I'm involved in. I've done debate for 5 years now, and this was my first true introduction to the political spectrum. And politics and partisan topics are incredibly common arguments within debate itself. So, obviously, I had to do more research into them. And one of the first few things that I noticed was that the political spectrum was influenced by numerous factors, and many times people did not realize that their political views were influenced by those external circumstances. So that is what I wanted to explore more with this project, and the specific political views that I picked for this project were lawyers. So the reason I did this was because my love for debate led me to the field of law. And basically, alongside data science, I also wanted to incorporate law into my project since I was possibly considering going into that as a career field, which is why I ended up picking lawyers to work on my project for. So, the research question that I have for my project is how do the political ideologies and campaign contributions of lawyers compare both across states and across time? So, going into the background for my project, I used research from Stanford professor Adam Bonica from a paper that he made in 2014. Basically, what he did is he collected data to determine the ideological distribution of American lawyers based on a numerical value that he dubbed the CF score, which is basically a numerical representation of how liberal or conservative a person can be. The conclusion that he drew from his paper was that lawyers are ideologically heterogeneous, which means that they're equally liberal or conservative. So the goal of my project is to revise this conclusion with more recent data from election years and answer the key question, does Bonica's conclusion still hold in the status quo? So going into the data, to answer this research question, I used the DIME dataset, which is a comprehensive ideological mapping of political elites, interest groups, and donors within society. So this dataset basically contains political contributions made both by individuals and corporations across time within election campaigns. So it would basically be measuring how much somebody donated to an election campaign on either the Democratic or conservative side. And it includes federal elections from 1979 to 2020. So, what this data will be able to provide is a comprehensive understanding as to the factors influencing the political ideologies of lawyers. And to do so, the variables that I focused on were gender, profession, location, as well as CF scores. So, I took all of these variables from the contribution data set within DIME. So, in terms of getting the lawyers, the first thing that I did was to parse the contribution data set and search for the owner's self described occupation. So, terms that I included were attorney, law, lawyer, etc. So, in order to do this, I coded in R and used a fuzzy string match, which resulted in a unique data set of lawyers with 796,180 contributors. So I focused on generating three main graphs, which would be gender, which analyzes the question of whether ideologies would vary based on whether they are a man or a woman. I also did corporations versus individuals, which analyzes whether ideologies are different for big corporations, where there's a lot of influence and possibly even pressure to identify within a certain side of the political spectrum, and are they different for individual people who have a lot more freedom? And also donations per year, which analyzes whether donations to for campaigns in election years vary within individuals and corporations significantly. So in order to generate these graphs, I use different methods. So for the gender graph, I grouped the data by men and women by looking at the gender variable. And I also grouped these people from two different states, California and Pennsylvania. So I picked these two states because of their geographic location. They're pretty far, geographically, at least in the United States, and also generally pretty known for like opposing or polarizing views. For generating the graph for corporations and individuals, I grouped the data by separating the corporations from everyone else in the contribution data set that I uniquely created, which I did by looking at the gender variable and picking out all the people which had a gender of NA, which meant companies within the DIME data set. And to generate the last graph, I just grouped the contribution amounts by year. So getting into the results, this is the graph that I ended up generating for ideology by gender. So you can see that the x-axis represents gender, F for females, M for males, and then the y-axis represents the ideology. The numerical values you see there are the CF scores. So figure 1 shows that on average, male lawyers are slightly more conservative than their female counterparts. However, the average ideology for male lawyers remains generally liberal, with a mean of like 75% and the interquartile range being less than 0. So there's a higher variability in the ideological distribution of male lawyers compared to female lawyers, as shown by the broader interquartile range. So this would be within California. Now moving to the graph for Pennsylvania, we again see that male lawyers are more likely to be conservative than female lawyers, because you can see that they range higher up on the y-axis, though the average lawyer still remains liberal because their mean is going to be less than 0 on the CF score. So however, there's also a greater variation on the Pennsylvania side, because lawyers are slightly more conservative compared to their female counterparts, whereas where conservative lawyers are the outlier. Okay, so going on to graph 2, this is the graph for corporations versus individuals. So observing the curve as a whole, figure 1 shows that individuals' ideologies tend to peak at the liberal -1 value, which you can see by the blue curve, whereas corporations, the red curve, tend to peak at around more than -0.3 or 4 value, which you can see by the red curve. So because of this, you can see that generally corporations tend to be more neutral than individuals in terms of their political ideologies, and they overall tend to have more conservative values. So the mean for the corporations is represented by the dashed line, while the mean for the individuals is going to be represented by the dotted line. So on average, the mean for individuals show that they tend to be more liberal, while the mean for corporations show that they fall more firmly in the center. So now going on to figure 3, this is the figure that shows the donations per every single election. So observing these curves as a whole, you can see that corporations generally tend to donate higher amounts. Again, corporations are represented by the red curve, and you can see that all the peaks for corporations are further down on the x-axis, which represent the monetary amounts. And whereas individuals, they peak closer to the x-axis in ranges of 0 to 500 for the most part, which makes sense for the most part, since corporations obviously have a lot more money than individuals. So in 2008 and 2012, the donation amounts for both corporations and individuals remained relatively the same. However, in 2016 and 2020, you can see that while individuals peak at around 100, 250, and 500, corporations actually peak around 500, 250, 500, and $1,000. So a similar situation can also be seen in the graph for 2020, where individuals peak at around $100, where corporations peak at 250, 500, and 1,000. So this shows that individuals donated less money in 2020 than 2020 than they did in 2016, while corporations remain majorly unaffected. A reasonable conclusion for this could be the effects of the COVID pandemic, and on the financial incomes of a majority of the individuals being affected. Another possible conclusion is that the election year in 2020 was just a lot more polarizing and got a lot more people involved in terms of voting and expressing their political views. So going into the conclusion of this whole research project, in terms of the research question itself, what do the graphs mean? So basically, all of the graphs essentially align with Bonica's conclusion of the political spectrum being majorly heterogeneous, again, meaning that people are equal amounts liberal and conservative. So what this means is that even in today's political spectrum, the number of people that are liberal and conservative among lawyers are still evenly distributed as they were in 2014. So now my project also explored the external factors and drew conclusions on 3 other things through the graph. First, the first conclusion that we got was that women lawyers generally tend to be more liberal. However, the average score for both men and women remain generally liberal regardless of the state, which in this case, we use California and Pennsylvania, which are pretty like polarizing in terms of their political views. Second thing we learned was that individuals tend to be more liberal while corporations are more moderate with donations on either side, which kind of went against my initial conclusion that corporations may actually be more significantly on one side than on the other. And the last thing that I learned, the last conclusion that I drew from this project was that most lawyer contributions that are individuals tend to be small dollar amounts, as seen in Figure 3, with many more donors participating in the 2020 election, while corporations tended to donate a lot more. So basically, in terms of future research, the areas that we could explore in the future is like comparing political ideologies of lawyers to other professions and comparing the ideologies throughout the US to see whether they differ on geopolitical context and comparing within a left-leaning and right-leaning swing states. And what I learned was how to handle large data sets with very specific data, how to code and use R and Python packages to create informational graphs, and as well as the many external factors that can influence a political spectrum and ideologies in the status quo. Okay, thank you. Any questions?
Yes, we do have a question from Veronica. Do you anticipate this trend continuing in the 2024 election?
I think that considering the events that have occurred so far, I think that generally the political ideologies of people should remain the same as we've seen them remain relatively constant through 2014 and 2020. And even last year they were pretty constant considering that we had the same presidents, same main two people running for the election being Trump and Biden. The political ideologies still remain ideologically heterogeneous. However, I do think that it might have an effect on campaign donations, which would be Figure 3, because considering all of the events that have happened between 2020 and 2024, people generally have very strong views in society today about which candidate that they support within today's election campaign, which I think would get a lot more people involved in voting and generally just result in more people donating money.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sahana.